hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. And so as you know, this is the last talk of this year's series from the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Simon Fraser University. And we had a wonderful series of talks this year from Zoe Todd to Justin Haruyama to Angie Wiley and now to Danielle Dinovelli-Lang. So I would like to acknowledge that I am talking to you today from the unceded, or as my colleague Rudy Reimer-Yumps calls it, occupied lands. And this is the land of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish people. And yesterday I had the privilege of attending a Zoom talk hosted by UBC, where the Potawatomi scholar and philosopher Kyle White, who's now based at the University of Michigan, was speaking. And he talked about taking the long-term view of national and indigenous history, where it doesn't just start with colonization, but goes back a number of millennia. So in this longer-term view, colonialism, he was saying, may be a phase that is ultimately transcended. And he was thinking that such a period may have lasted 500 or 600 years, but could be dissolved through the gradual accumulation of diverse and yet steady efforts. And I would hope that we might reflect today on what we can all do as individuals and in pushing any organizations or institutions that we are affiliated with to work towards that dissolution. And I think this is hard work to imagine and hard work to implement, but Kyle White's formulation prompted in me a different way to dream that future. And I know that today's speaker is also deeply engaged with this kind of work and asks the kinds of deep and challenging questions that will be helpful to create ways forward. So in terms of today's event, we have the space until about 2:30, and you are welcome to ask questions throughout the talk by opening up your Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, but just so that you know that they won't be answered until the end. And I just wanted to remind you that this event is being recorded and that it will be available on our departmental website in the coming weeks. And when it's available, we will send an email out to you. For those of you who want some live entertainment, closed captioning is available. You can enable it by selecting live transcript at the bottom of the screen. I always enjoy watching the various formulations that emerge. And so now I have the privilege to introduce today's speaker. So Danielle Dinovelli-Lang is a professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, and her work foregrounds the co-production of nature and difference, especially in colonial situations, such as in Southeast Alaska. She's now coming up on 2 decades of work there in a few years. And her PhD thesis from Columbia University explored debates around the definition and extent of subsistence hunting and fishing rights in rural Alaska. And one of the elements of her work that I find most fascinating is to ask the question of how non-human animals might be legitimizing or delegitimizing competing forms of environmental governance, of what kinds of roles that they themselves might be playing that is beyond this purely human monopoly that we usually imagine in environmental governance. And together with her colleague, Karen Hebert, Dinovelli-Lang is also investigating what they call ecological labor. And by this, they mean not merely the labor demanded by projects of environmental protection and conservation, whereas normally we think of the labor of resource extraction, but also they're interested in the many engagements that are being reconfigured as ecologically reproductive care work. And they're interested in the way the care work has affective and performative dimensions, which in today's realm can often be more highly valued than objective results. So this is one of the many projects she is involved with. And in closing, I'll just say that when I mentioned to one of my SFU colleagues that she was speaking in our series, she said that Dinovelli is, quote, one of the smartest people out there. And so I agree. And I love her ending line in describing her work as how things play out in a, quote, world worth fighting for. And I think that we should be grateful that Dinovelli is in the fight. Thank you, Danielle.
Good grief, Michael. That is a extremely intimidating and generous introduction. Yeah, it's beautiful. The paper that I'm going to read you today, to say it doesn't live up to any of that, but it does probably at least reflect my long-term struggle with the things that Michael mentioned. And I hope some of you may have noticed that they didn't necessarily fit together all that well. And so really it's how to, my I guess basically at this point, lifelong interest in trying to understand how to talk about some of the things that get called nature in a way that doesn't disregard the relations of exploitation that take place in those arenas, at the same time as not wanting to sort of overdetermine these relationships by talking about them in terms of exploitation. And by saying that here, that is a sort of preoccupation of this paper in a way that might be a bit less fun than some of the things I've written, and that maybe you're here to talk about, but there are some hopefully enough tidbits in here, and I won't say much more because also the other thing I have to apologize for is the length of the paper, again reflecting this sort of attempt to put some things together that don't really fit together that well. If there is time at the end, which I hope there is, I really would like to talk about that issue, which I think is worth talking about in this context. So thank you, and thanks everyone for being here. Where Michael spoke from, but I would also like to add that I'm coming from Ottawa, which is unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. I'm very grateful to have been able to think about this stuff here, as well as in Southeast Alaska, which is Tlingit territory in every respect. Okay, so brown bear claws can grow to be 4 inches long from knuckle to tip. Attached to the paw of a living bear, their length and slight curvature make them ideal for digging up the nutritious roots of young plants in early spring. Detached from the bear, their durability as well as their distinctive size and shape make them well suited for use in ceremonial regalia or handcrafted jewelry. They can also sometimes be found separately from the fleshly bear, but still attached to its painstakingly preserved skin as part of a magnificent trophy. Although this list is certainly not exhaustive, it is already quite troublesome since many of these uses are both mutually dependent and mutually exclusive. In societies where the capitalist mode of production prevails, the task of rationally prioritizing among such conflicting uses tends to be delegated to the market, where incomparable use values are translated into comparable exchange values. As it functions in relation to the few humans and many bears of Alaska's Pacific coast, however, the market in bear claws has delivered what some have considered to be vexing results, especially when the aperture is widened to consider how the seemingly one-way process of production in this case is sustainably reproduced. What follows is a story of one set of efforts to make the market work for the production of value in brown bear claws and of the inequities entrenched in its name. Alaskan coastal brown bears, although technically the same species as the grizzlies of the lower 48 in the US or the interior in Canada, grow to be typically twice as large. Unlike most of the world's bears, they are neither threatened nor endangered in their home territory. They flourish at or above historical populations across the range, which extends from the large islands of the northern end of the Southeast Alaskan Panhandle to the Alaska Peninsula in the Southwest. Thanks both to their relatively large body size and population abundance, they are legally hunted throughout the state, sometimes by rural Alaskan residents for their own subsistence purposes, but far more often by non-resident sportsmen pursuing a trophy. A non-resident hunter will pay over $20,000 to kill a single large coastal brown bear, a money price that includes the cost of hiring a registered guide, plus room and board for the duration of the hunt, but normally excludes license, tag, and trophy fees paid to the state of Alaska. The amount of money flowing into the state as a result of this business in brown bears is significant. For example, in Game Unit 4, an approximately 5,000 square mile area encompassing the islands of the northern end of the Southeast Alaskan Panhandle, 87 brown bears were taken by non-resident hunters participating in guided trophy hunts in the year 2013. This means that well over $1 million changed hands in exchange for the lives of those 87 bears that year, which was by no means an unusually productive one. Despite this recurrent bonanza in bears, this part of Southeast Alaska is better known to outsiders for decades of controversy over large-scale logging operations in the Tongass National Forest, a federally protected area covering 90% of the region's landmass, including Game Unit 4. While the forest bears provide a steady source of revenue for the state, the US Forest Service's timber program has been operating at a net loss for decades, including an estimated 16 million in 2019 alone. This government subsidy once supported thousands of full-time jobs in the region, but employment in the timber industry has declined precipitously since the late 1990s. Between those losses and a state-regulated fishing industry that has remained viable through strict limitations on the number of permits available, the human residents of the census tract that overlays most of Game Unit 4 get by at an average annual income 30% below the statewide average and a poverty rate 30% above it. The majority are Alaska Native, concentrated in the Tlingit villages of Hoonah on Chichagof Island and Angoon on Admiralty Island. Some village residents earn year-round salaries working for their tribal or municipal governments or at the school, and some do well enough working seasonally in what's left of the seafood and timber industries or in the tourism industry that has moved in to replace these. But almost no one would do well enough to maintain homes in their villages year-round if it were not for their ability to directly access the wild resources that still fill their territories, lands, and waters, and which, combined with the spirit of mutual support that comes with living in a tight-knit community interwoven with both ancient and modern kin obligations, help span the yawning gap between scant summertime wages and the high cost of living in rural Alaska. While Pacific salmon now, as in the past, make up the bulk of subsistence production in the region, brown bears have also been exploited for subsistence. In times of need, this has meant that their flesh was eaten as food, but far more often brown bears have been used for ceremonial purposes or for customary trade. In the early part of the 20th century, customary trade entailed selling bear hides for cash, which was increasingly necessary to continue to pursue subsistence hunting, fishing, and gathering as a way of life. Nowadays, the selling of whole hides is prohibited with respect to brown bears taken under subsistence regulations in Game Unit 4. But it is still permissible to sell handicrafts made from the parts of otherwise legally taken brown bears within certain strict but notoriously indeterminate regulatory parameters. For example, legally sold handicrafts must show evidence of significant alteration from the raw material, and their production for sale must not constitute a significant commercial enterprise, imposing a hard line between customary trade on the one hand and profit-making activity on the other. Through this rigidly enforced dichotomy, the production of surplus value is kept apart from what then becomes reified as a more culturally authentic kind of resource use. Such prescriptions concerning the sale of brown bear handicrafts under subsistence regulations thus present a stark and telling contrast to the equally meticulously regulated, but in its case, value maximizing non-resident sport hunt. In the pages that follow, I examine the efforts of state and federal resource management agencies to introduce a small but significant additional restriction on subsistence brown bear hunters and handicrafters. I analyze the formation and activities of the Brown Bear Claw Handicraft Working Group, henceforward Working Group, an initiative to bring stakeholders together to resolve what had by the time of its creation become a long-running conflict over brown bear claw handicraft sales. In doing so, I describe an important but under-recognized aspect of the practical and ideological work that goes into sustaining capitalist value as a singular overawing force, which later appears to govern the behavior of its subjects as an inviolable law. The remainder of this too long paper is divided into 5 parts. In the next section, I describe an impasse in contemporary efforts to understand the relationship between Marxian value theory and non-human nature and environmental anthropology and critical geography, offering a reading, perhaps a quixotic reading, I will admit, of Gayatri Spivak's scattered speculations on the question of value as a way around this. In the subsequent section, I provide a brief history of the importance and regulation of subsistence hunting in Alaska. That subsistence here means something quite different than what it means in common political economic usage, begs the question of the continued use of the term and the intensity of its regulation by the various forces of the state. Armed with Spivak's sharp attention to efforts to close the circuit of value, I then describe in some detail the efforts of the working group to contain the value of brown bear claws and the reactions to and consequences of their efforts. I conclude by discussing the theoretical and practical significance of the struggle of subsistence hunters and advocates in Alaska to protect their way of life against these efforts to secure the value of bear claws and other natural resources as such. Okay, I'm going to read this part, but it's problematic. Okay, the value of nature. So as I think those of you here know, there's a big debate, I'm just going to talk for a second, about the labor theory of value. There's always a debate about the labor theory of value. Does it make sense or does it not? But one of the major issues in the contemporary manifestation of the debate is basically whether it's kind of Marx's fault for not seeing the value of nature, whether it's capitalism's fault, So that's the sort of framework of the debate. And within this debate, one of the things I sort of have noticed in reading it is that the partisans have tended to take as given the ontological premises supporting the exclusion of nature from the labor theory of value. That is, they've accepted that the labor theory of value indeed rests on human exceptionalism, and that this is problematic because the values that come from non-human nature, including everything from those produced by laboring farm animals to environmental services, are ignored in theory and degraded in practice. This sets up a theoretical division between those eco-critical scholars who believe Marxism is irrevocably compromised by its complicity in human exceptionalism at one extreme, and those who believe that Marx's understanding of the discounting of nature and capitalist production constitutes the only adequate explanation for the current environmental crisis on the other. There's more to say about that. But a surprisingly consistent feature of the arguments of those defending Marx from eco-critical charges of human exceptionalism is the claim that Marx himself was not the author of the labor theory of value. Following Diane Elson, they argue Marx was the author instead of a value theory of labor, which explains why labor measures value in capitalist production while suspending disbelief on the question of value's material substance. Freed from its ontological tether in the distinctiveness of human labor, the capitalist value form can be shown to be at work analogously in all kinds of situations where the particular contribution of human labor is difficult, if not impossible, to track. I'm just going to interject to say I think there's something wrong with that. Okay, in rescuing Marx from his besides what I'm about to say here, well, this is one of the things that's wrong. In rescuing Marx from his humanism by denying it, however, Marx's defenders implicitly accept the humanist characterization of labor and nature as mutually exclusive categories of action. When more ecologically minded critics attack the labor theory of value for excluding nature, they read labor as occupying the entire productive space that should be given to nature and value, thus also ironically reinforcing the idea that where labor is, nature is not, and vice versa. This abandonment of human labor to humanism is both analytically and politically unfortunate. Analytically, it dulls critical attention to the deepening and unevenly distributed forms of exploitation that accompany contemporary modes of the production of value of nature. Politically, it leads even a person so precisely attuned to the power of rhetoric as Donna Hathaway to recently offer "make kin not babies" as a slogan. But the risk of such Malthusian drift does not mean the solution is to embrace an unreconstructed socialist humanism as the only path out of our current predicament either. Besides, this kind of thinking's track record of appropriating indigenous territory for the common good in theory and practice, normative expectations it places on working class consciousness remain analytically and practically indefensible, in my view. Given that both these problems must be addressed, and Nancy Fraser is who I was quoting there, given that both these problems must be addressed if Marxist categories are to have meaningful relevance in Indigenous Alaska, it seems that Marx's humanism needs to be confronted and transformed rather than dismissed or denied. So I see a way to do this in Gayatri Spivak's strictly materialist, albeit deconstructivist reading of Marx's value theory. As you well know, I hope, the crux of Marx's labor theory of value, as Spivak rightly emphasizes, is that the extraction of surplus value and the accumulation of capital, which is the raison d'etre of capitalism, cannot be conceived without human labor's absolutely unique capacity to produce more than it requires. This superadequate differential depends on the use value of labor power consumed by capital and commodity production, generating more exchange value in a given period of time than is required to sustain the same labor power's capacity to produce in such excess, time and time again. The capitalist is therefore able to pay a wage equivalent to the exchange value of the worker's labor power, value of the means of subsistence necessary to reproduce the worker as such, while nevertheless reaping something more than this in the eventual return on the exchange value of the commodities produced by the productive consumption of that same labor power's use value. This is why human labor alone of all commodities produces value rather than just bearing it. Well, none of this departs from Marx's own analysis of the value form in Capital Volume 1. Spivak highlights what she calls the quote unquote discontinuities rather than the contradictions within the thread of Marx's argument to make the point that value does not merely represent human labor as an ontological given, it actively differentiates it, in effect reads it into distinct parcels of use and exchange, subsistence and surplus, reproduction and production. Spivak glimpses this insertion into textuality, it's what she calls it, at several key moments in Marx's argument, three of which relate directly to the question of subsistence. One of these is with respect to primitive accumulation. which addresses the problem that the distinction between the value of a given worker's subsistence requirements and the value of their produced commodities only makes sense in a situation in which the worker's labor power really is a commodity distinct from the worker themselves. This entails the complete separation of the worker from the means of production, something that is the result of the capitalist relations of production and is elsewhere supposed to have caused. Another moment is the necessary possibility that, quote, the worker consumes the affect of the work itself, which Spivak points out confounds the distinction between subsistence and surplus as determined entirely by social necessity rather than individual desire. And finally, even if we granted that the value of the means of subsistence was a completely economic thing, in order for it to work to yield a new generation of workers, the excessively open-ended, this is another quote of hers, dynamics of birth, growth, family life, reproduction are called upon to make this happen. By raising the question of desire and the infinite array of different economic arrangements that constrain and enable productive labor, Spivak opens the textual chain of value to the affective material labor of subsistence and reproduction, rather than relying on what she refers to as the idealist predication of the subject and consciousness. In other words, she derives the superadequate potential of labor power from the multitude of different labors suppressed and enclosed under the material concept of subsistence, which itself encloses reproduction, instead of from an ideal upper limit of technological progress aligned with universal humanity, as in more teleological, or in Spivak's words, continuous readings of Marxist text. I find this description of an open-ended labor theory of value helpful, not only because it manages to avoid invoking obvious humanist categories such as consciousness or free will, but also because it avoids what I consider to be the false materialism of the concept of nature. Nature is inextricably linked and opposed to consciousness within a humanist discourse that divides human from animal, as mind from body, as master to slave, as man to woman. When, in an attempt to reverse or even out the relations of domination implied by these binary oppositions, nature is offered as an alternative valuation to that of capitalism, this situates it simultaneously against and above economic value. This is a mistake because, as Spivak demonstrates with respect to so-called cultural values, which he's actually talking about in the essay, quote, the value form in the general sense and the narrow, the economic sphere is commonly understood being the latter, are irreducibly complicitous. The openness of value to its enabling conditions means that any discourse on the value of nature or culture will be tied up in the relations of exploitation that directly and indirectly enable that discourse. This goes both ways. Efforts to close off the economic for the sake of analysis are just as futile as efforts to rescue whole chunks of the planet or areas of study from their participation in the constitution of value. While this may seem a grim conclusion, I believe it points the way forward to understanding the production of value in and through the entangled complexity that is so problematically captured under the concept of nature. With respect to the case at hand, it gives me something new to notice in contests surrounding the management of Alaskan coastal brown bears, rather than a struggle between one set of values and another, which I am ashamed to say is a shorthand that I've always used to describe my own work. So the people I'm criticizing in this are me and others. I can begin to describe a struggle over the determination of value itself, traceable in this case through dynamics of opening and closure related to the longstanding struggle over the meaning of and practice of subsistence in Alaska. While this is most often presented as a struggle over what does and does not count as subsistence for the sake of securing or eroding subsistence hunting and fishing rights, I will show that it can equally well be understood as a struggle to contain the open-ended potential of subsistence production so that it may continue to function theoretically and practically to secure the value of capitalist nature. Okay, that's sort of it for the theory, but now you guys are going to learn about subsistence management in Alaska. I hope you're excited because it's pretty detailed and complex, but most people don't know about it. So you're going to get to know. Very exciting. Okay. In Alaska, not too far from where you are, subsistence hunting on federal public lands is subject to a complicated system of dual management by both the federal and state governments. The state, under the auspices of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, henceforward ADF&G, it's not that much easier to say, but a little bit, manages sport hunting, trapping, and so-called personal use hunting on private, state, and federal lands, as well as quote-unquote subsistence hunting on private and state lands. The federal government manages subsistence hunting only on federal public lands, and only with respect to federally qualified subsistence hunters. Federal qualification pertains to residents of rural areas of the state in accordance with the Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act of 1980, henceforward ANILCA. which defines subsistence as, quote, the customary and traditional uses by rural Alaska residents of wild renewable resources for direct personal or family consumption as food, shelter, fuel, clothing, tools, or transportation for the making and selling of handicraft articles of non-edible byproducts of fish and wildlife resources taken for personal or family consumption for barter or sharing for personal or family consumption and for customary trade. ANILCA also declares that subsistence as defined above should be the priority consumptive use of fish and wildlife on public lands, and it lays out the conditions under which other uses may be excluded to provide for, quote, the continuation of subsistence uses by rural residents of Alaska, including both natives and non-natives. The rural priority, as the above set of directives has come to be known, is the linchpin of the federal subsistence management program. It was controversial from the moment of its inception in 1980, when its to-the-letter implementation by the state of Alaska excluded many subsistence-reliant Alaska Native communities from its protections. Since 1989, when the Alaska Supreme Court decided in McDowell versus State of Alaska that the rural priority nevertheless violated the Equal Access Clause of the state constitution, which is what forced the federal government to take over subsistence management, it has become the principle distinguishing the federal from state regimes and the line dividing the Alaskan public into pro and anti-subsistence camps. For the federally qualified subsistence hunters the law purportedly favors, it represents their right to continue to use the wild resources around them as they always have. For those opposed to this principle as unconstitutional exclusion, it arbitrarily denies urban Alaskans their right to an equal share in the state's natural wealth. But the controversy over the rural priority is arguably more the result than the cause of the deeper antagonisms underlying the Alaskan subsistence debates. On the one side of the debate, represented partly, but by no means exclusively by the state of Alaska's official position since McDowell, subsistence is considered one form of resource use among others, of state-owned common property resources whose value is determined by the relation between supply and demand on the open market. Like sport hunting and sport and commercial fishing, it is therefore subject to state management, which by law balances principles of conservation biology with resource economics to collect and allocate the sum total of this resource wealth for maximum use consistent with the public interest. Although subsistence is still considered the priority use of wild resources under state law, if there's not enough of a given resource to go around, subsistence is supposed to be the last type of resource use eliminated. In practice, the state priority is only invoked when overharvest has been allowed to the point that the biological survival of both human and non-human populations is in jeopardy. This usually happens long after the actual subsistence users, whose special relationship to wild resources the state law does not acknowledge, have stopped hunting in an effort to save the threatened game population. Thus, and despite subsistence hunters' efforts to the contrary, the classical political economic association between subsistence and poverty is quite ruthlessly enforced. On the other side of the debate, rural subsistence practice as a continuation of tradition denotes not just a certain necessary intensity of wild resource use, which may or may not preclude others' uses of the same resources, but also an interchange between Alaska Native people and their land that constitutes an entire way of life predicated on the maintenance of economically, ecologically, and above all, politically affective relations between diverse human and non-human actors. The practices regulated under ANILCA as subsistence by no means exhaust the catalog of these relations, but they do represent a particularly crucial way in which the interdependency of people and territory is performed and maintained. Subsistence practices do not only mitigate the cash poverty of rural Alaska Native communities, they also reiteratively represent the land as a form of communal wealth, nurtured rather than negated through subsistence labor. This affective quality of subsistence production should be understood as part of what explains the otherwise unexpected endurance of subsistence economies, despite the ever-increasing availability of cash and access to market throughout the North. In short, subsistence produces more, not less, than the alienated alternative of capitalist commodity production. The inadequacy of the word subsistence to describe these practices of affective excess on the one hand, and the inadequacy of market logics to limit subsistence to direct consumption on the other, resonates with Spivak's discussion of the textuality of value. Spivak identifies value as the factor securing the purely economic logic of capital accumulation against the incursions of politics in the way that it permits the exploitation of labor to occur under the cover of equal exchange. But in order to function in this capacity, value depends on the reduction of the vast array of reproductive and productive labor conducted outside the realm of capitalist production proper to a quantity of the means of subsistence, which then determines the value of the labor power. The necessary ambivalence surrounding the value of subsistence, on the one hand, nil, as in mere subsistence, or the annihilation of value and consumption. And on the other hand, the extra, the indeterminable, quote unquote, social factor in the price of labor represents, therefore, a key opening where value spills out from its economic container and into politics. Efforts to contain the value and meaning of Alaska Native subsistence represent a similar extra-economic state-led intervention to secure the subjective value from the threat of its own constitution and politics, in this case, by rigorously enforcing a separation between nature and the market. Now we're going to part of it. Another agency, another acronym, I'm sorry. One of the most crucial official venues in the struggle over the meaning of subsistence in Alaska is the US Federal Subsistence Board, or I'm going to try to call it the board. Suddenly vested with managerial responsibility after the state of Alaska fell out of compliance with ANILCA, the board remains the final authority on all new regulations pertaining to subsistence hunting and fishing on federal lands in Alaska. It is made up of the regional directors of each of the 5 federal landholding agencies, plus a chair appointed by the Secretary of the Interior. Bound by ANILCA to follow the recommendations of 10 regional advisory councils, which receive proposed subsistence regulations directly from rural residents, and to uphold the rural priority, the board, with its panel of high-level political appointees, joins the politics of Alaskan subsistence to the politics of the United States writ large. Accordingly, in public meetings, the board I attended in 2006 and 2007, and in transcripts I studied for meetings before and after that time, the proposals that generated the most extensive discussion were scrutinized as much for their effects on the battlefield of dual management, and thence their implications for issues ranging from states' rights to native sovereignty, as for their effects on subsistence hunting and fishing as a practical activity. Those years were bad for subsistence. According to veteran managers on both sides who had participated in the early development of the state's program before McDowell, or provided support to the nascent federal program after it, the rural priority was being slowly undermined. In particular, the bottom-up structure of federal subsistence management, in which the needs and expertise of rural subsistence hunters and fishermen, expressed through the RACs, were supposed to drive the regulatory process, was under assault from all corners. The RACs were receiving less money to meet in more remote villages and undertake crucial ethnographic research in support of their recommendations. Under the guise of better alignment between state and federal regulations, their recommendations to the board had been overruled on a number of key issues without adequate justification. And while ANILCA had dictated that RAC membership should consist of federally qualified rural residents, a clause in the Federal Administrative Code had recently been reinterpreted to mean that the RACs must be representative of all resource user groups affected by the board's decisions, including the very sport hunters whose wealth and power were presumably driving all of the above efforts to undermine ANILCA itself. This was the context in which in 2009, the board created the Brown Bear Claw Handicraft Working Group to develop a method to recommend to the Federal Subsistence Board and the State Board of Game for tracking brown bear claws made into handicrafts that is enforceable and culturally sensitive, commensurate with the need to provide conservation of this wildlife resource. That's the quote of the group's charge. The problem, framed within the dubious politics of alignment I've just described, was a disparity between state and federal regulations governing the sale of handicrafts made from the parts of legally hunted brown bears. Whereas rural Alaskan residents hunting on the federal public lands were theoretically allowed to make and sell handicrafts incorporating the claws of brown bears taken under federal subsistence regulations, those hunting under state regulations could only sell bear claws attached to the hide of a bear taken from a designated predator control area and officially sealed, that is, physically inspected and marked with a unique identifier by a Fish and Game officer. According to Fish and Game, this small opening to the circulation of unsealed brown bear claws posed a massive problem for law enforcement, undermining the agency's ability to trace claws it might encounter on the world market to legally, or in the absence of an accompanying sealing certificate, illegally taken bears. The possibility that an unidentified claw might nevertheless have been legally obtained amounted, in Fish and Game's language, to, quote, an invitation to illegal harvests. On the other side, RAC members and rural residents opposed to the change argued that the practical demands of meeting state sealing requirements constituted an undue burden on federally qualified subsistence users of brown bears. Ethnographic research originally conducted by the state of Alaska's own division of subsistence in the 80s had found that many of the steps required to legally seal a brown bear constituted serious violations of Alaska Native legal traditions pertaining to the ethical treatment of brown bears, especially the handling of skulls. In Western Alaska, Inupiat hunters traditionally leave the bear's skull in the field where it has been killed, facing west, as part of a set of practices meant to ensure the safe passage of the bear's spirit. In Southeast Alaska, the jaw and teeth of a brown bear are carefully retained for use as tools and in ceremonial regalia. State sealing requirements, by contrast, typically require the entire skull and hide, with claws and evidence of sex attached, to be presented to a fish and game officer who measures it, extracts a premolar tooth for age information, and literally bolts a metal seal to the skull and hide. The hunter, who will have had to transport these massive pieces of bear from the remote location of the kill to a central fish and game office for measurement, must also sign an affidavit confirming the date and location of the kill. The real burden of these requirements, plus applicable license and tag fees, can be appreciated in studies showing that as few as 3% of brown bears taken by subsistence hunters in Western Alaska between 1977 and 1987 were eventually reported to wildlife managers. And subsistence brown bear hunting in Southeast Alaska had declined steeply since the imposition of state sealing requirements in the 60s. So for the first decade or so of federal subsistence management had been characterized by RAC-led efforts to recognize and support exactly these kinds of customary and traditional subsistence practices that had been forced underground by the indifference, if not outright hostility, of such top-down wildlife regulations. In keeping with this ameliorative project, the board had gradually adopted a number of proposals to liberalize federal subsistence brown bear regulations, up to and including in 2004, when the board finally affirmed the right of rural residents to make and sell handicrafts made from the skin, hide, pelt, or fur, including claws of a brown bear. Fish and Game immediately sought to overturn the new brown bear rules, challenging at one time or another between 2004 and 2008 the federal definition of fur, handicraft, and sale. Perhaps not coincidentally, around the same time, the federal government's stance towards subsistence management took its troublingly conciliatory turn. In 2006, abruptly replacing the activist board chair who had overseen the decade of liberalization with a former chair of the State Board of Game, along with the other changes noted above. Despite these ominous moves, once customary and traditional uses are formally recognized, the board is required to defend them unless there is substantial evidence that doing so would, quote, violate recognized principles of fish and wildlife conservation, or would itself be detrimental to the satisfaction of subsistence needs, end quote. All the state's proposals up to 2008 were rejected for consistently failing to meet this standard. The problem, for those who sought to justify renewed restrictions on subsistence uses of brown bear parts, was that these same years saw burgeoning brown bear populations throughout the state, in some regions approaching levels that depressed prey populations, sharply reducing the number of moose and other prized ungulates available for sport and subsistence hunters. In response, the State Board of Game had doubled the annual allowable limit for brown bears taken by Alaska resident hunters in parts of the state's interior, and authorized the sale of raw, untanned skin with claws attached for brown bears taken in designated predator control areas. Meanwhile, it was continuing to closely manage lucrative guided sport hunts for brown bears in coastal Southeast and South Central Alaska. Fish and Game's 2008 proposal, which asked the board to limit the sale of handicrafts made from the claws of brown bears taken under federal subsistence regulations exclusively to other federally qualified rural Alaskan residents, considered alongside these other developments, looks more like a move to corner the market in brown bears than to address a genuine concern for the species' biological well-being. Despite this, rather than rejecting the 2008 proposal, as it had rejected similar proposals in prior years, the board voted instead to defer it at the request of the Commissioner of Fish and Game in order to allow for the creation of a collaborative working group, the Brown Bear Claw Handicraft Working Group, to develop an alternative ANILCA-compliant proposal for tracking brown bear claws. The fact that the working group was created at Fish and Game's request, specifically in order to get around to the impasse posed by the bedrock federal subsistence law, was no small part of the controversy surrounding the group. Insofar as the working group was purpose-built to overcome the problem of the board's obligation to protect customary and traditional subsistence uses, any proposal it might eventually table was bound to undermine the spirit, if not the letter, of the federal law establishing the priority of subsistence over non-subsistence, meaning sport, uses of brown bear, that subsistence advocates had fought so hard to articulate and preserve. The Southeast Regional Advisory Council to the Federal Subsistence Board in particular saw things this way, and it took the extraordinary step of boycotting the deliberations of the working group, even though its constituents would be among those most affected by any changes to brown bear claw handicraft regulations. And in fact, that boycott is what got me interested in this whole topic. Notably, the Western Arctic RAC, whose members and constituents reside in the same Inupiat villages surveyed in the earlier division of subsistence studies, also refused to participate in the group's work, in their case, citing the impropriety of speaking about brown bears at all. Thus, there were at least two distinct problems surrounding the working group and its charge. On the one hand, there was the problem of the incompatibility of sealing, along with other scientific wildlife management techniques, with the documented customs and traditions of subsistence brown bear hunters, whether these related to sacred cultural rituals or more generic but no less powerfully felt orientation towards creative and opportunistic uses of wild resources that characterize the Alaska Native subsistence ethic. On the other hand, there was the problem of the suspicious origins of the working group itself and an apparently politically motivated effort to undermine the authority given to rural Alaska subsistence practitioners under ANILCA. These two problems are more than circumstantially related in the matter of bear claws. Otherwise, why would there be so much investment from both sides in such a relatively minute piece of both the global traffic in wildlife parts and the robust subsistence economies of coastal Alaska? As I will demonstrate below, it is nothing other than value, which both circumscribes the contours of the struggle between the subsistence and anti-subsistence interests in bear claws, and which appears to resolve this unresolvable conflict through measure. Value is the subject of the working group's text. Getting there. Federal and state staff appointed to the working group met several times between 2009 and 2011, consulting with the participating RACs once at the start of the process and once at the conclusion. The result of their work was the following compromise. Quote, prior to selling a handicraft incorporating a brown bear claw, the hide or claws not attached to a hide must be sealed and authorized by a Fish and Game representative. To assure that the handicraft came from a brown bear hide that had been harvested by a federally qualified subsistence user, a copy of the Fish and Game sealing certificate would be required to accompany the handicraft when sold. On the one hand, compared to the state's earlier proposals, the working group's proposal was indeed a significant compromise. It allowed for the sale of brown bear claw containing handicrafts. It required sealing only if the handicrafts were to be sold to a non-federally qualified subsistence user, and it allowed the sealing of claws apart from the bear itself. On the other hand, it still imposed an additional burden on subsistence hunters and handicrafters without adequate justification. Indeed, by the time the proposal finally came up for a vote of the FSB in 2012, it was even clearer that the state's claim, first made in 2004 and repeated every regulatory cycle since, that subsistence handicraft sales imperiled Alaska's brown bears was patently false. As the staff analysis of the proposal repeated, quote, there is no evidence to indicate that federal subsistence regulations have led to an increasing legal or illegal harvest of brown bears, or that current federal subsistence regulations adversely affect brown bear populations. In the absence of any evidence of a conservation concern in the biological sense, the state relied on a conservation concern in the economic sense. Fish and Game's 2012 statement in support of the working group's proposal argued that, quote, sales of handicrafts made from brown bear claws, teeth, skulls, and bones present a particular problem because these are potentially high-value items, and allowing sales creates market incentives for illegal harvest in Alaska and other states. Under the subheading conservation concerns, it doubled down on this point, adding that when the board legalized the sale of handicrafts incorporating bear claws in 2012, it, quote, created a new market for bear claws and other high-value bear parts, which could readily mask illegal sales, thereby compounding problems with the international trade of endangered species and contributing to the illegal harvest, overharvest, and waste of bears in other states and countries, as well as Alaska. To paraphrase, what is particular about brown bear claw handicraft sales, according to Fish and Game, is that they provide an opening through which the market might be contaminated by extra-legal bear parts. In concert with the department's other efforts concerning brown bears, this suggests that the problem is not illegal harvest as such, but rather the possibility that the market could support this illegal harvest. Unable to question the dependency of its own conservation regime on the vagaries of the market, however, the state once again found itself scapegoating the one category of relations with bears that escapes this particular form of control, namely subsistence. Thus, the threat of the market to bears was substituted with the threat of subsistence to the market in order to sustain the legitimacy of the state's claim to exclusively mediate between the twin inhuman forces of brown bear reproductive biology and the law of value. The state's jealous attitude towards subsistence uses of brown bear is similarly evident in its own limited subsistence permitting program for the species. These regulations require that all the edible meat be salvaged and the bear's trophy value specifically abjured. Quote, the hide and skull need not be sealed unless removed from subsistence area or presented for commercial tanning. If sealing is required, it must be completed by the designated sealing officer. At the time of sealing, the skin of the head and front claws are removed and kept by Fish and Game. That part is in bold in the regulation. Note the asymmetry between this particular penalty and the regulations pertaining to sport hunted brown bear. In the latter case, a sport hunter is free to decide whether or not they want to salvage the meat, and they certainly aren't required to turn over any part of it to the state. Given this asymmetry, sport hunters may retain everything. Subsistence hunters may not retain the bear's claws or skin of the head. It seems clear these regulations are not about bears and their biological conservation, but rather about different classes of bear hunters and their status before the law. It is an enforceable statement of the principle that effort expended under the formal aegis of subsistence must be without access to the exchange value crystallized in the bear trophy, as a whole represented by the head, or in part represented by the claws, and that subsistence remain a labor without value as such. If the regulation works, it works upon would-be subsistence hunters as an enticement to redirect their efforts toward the complex of opportunity and value embodied in sport hunting as provided by the state. In contrast to this regulatory logic, the principles underpinning Alaska Native subsistence and the federal regulations that are supposed to reflect them seem to participate in an entirely different political economic scheme, one in which the value of a brown bear is neither measured by its size nor provided by the state. The fundamental difference here is that subsistence is recognized as both productive and reproductive labor, the necessary and unnecessary results of which the laborer is entitled to use and enjoy to the maximum extent possible. The multiplicity of uses comprising this open-ended maximum include not only immediate consumption, but also production for exchange, as well as, most crucially, the maintenance of a system of social relations between people and things that is not reducible to value. That subsistence is more, not less, than even the more expansive sense of its value implicit in federal law has been abundantly documented in testimony provided directly to the board through the RACs, indirectly through ethnographic research conducted by or referenced by staff, and emphatically by Alaska Native activists and allied scholars over the years. For example, testing before the board on the rural characteristics of the Tlingit village of Saxman in Southeast Alaska on the same day that the working group proposal was heard, a representative of a region-wide tribal government said, quote, "It's not just food, it's a way of life, it's a culture. So it's really important, and it's also important for the Native economies. It's used for traditional and customary trade. It's shared with other family members outside the state. So it's just more important than I think people realize. Unless you understand subsistence, you can't really understand how important it is." From this perspective, the clear problem with the compromise offered by the working group is that it advances rather than forestalls the real subsumption of the open-ended productive and reproductive labor of subsistence to the closed circuit of self-valorizing value. It does this in three ways. First, by literally and indelibly stamping certain clause, those destined for circulation with the seal of the state. It attempts to ensure the currency they represent in circulation remains the currency of trophy value. Second, it denies recognition of the objective value of subsistence hunters and particularly handicrafters' labor. The fact that the clause inclusion in the realm of value is bought at the price of subsistence's exclusion can be seen in the rationale the staff employed in their recommendation to adopt the working group's proposal. Quote, "It is possible that having proof that the claws are from a subsistence harvested brown bear could provide added value to a handicraft, as it would identify that the claws are from a legally harvested brown bear," end quote. This statement reduces the skilled productive labor involved in making a handicraft, never mind the reproductive labor sustaining a subsistence way of life, to a function of a legally certified identity category, and reinforces the state's position that the value of the clause determines the value of the handicraft. Indeed, the assumption that the clause make the handicraft was so pervasive during the discussion of the working group proposal leading up to the final vote that even the deliberants needed to be reminded that the proposal pertained to handicrafts and not to unprocessed clause. As one RAC chairman reminded the board, "I think one thing just for the public record that needs to be brought out, and that this is not for the sale of claws. This is for the sale of handicrafts that contain claws. It's not like you're opening the door for a harvest of claws to go on the open market. I think that makes a difference." If it did in the end make a difference, it was only to assuage those participants in the proceedings who would have liked to see a total ban on bear claw containing handicrafts restored. The working group compromise passed the Federal Subsistence Board by a 3-2 vote, along what had by then become well-worn divisions between the 5 federal land management agencies, depending on their state of conflict or harmony with Alaska Native subsistence claims. The new regulation essentially institutionalized the majorities and the state of Alaska's prejudice that subsistence must be excluded from the value realizing potential of the market. 4, the third and perhaps most insidious way that the working group proposal worked to close the circuit of self-valorizing value at the expense of Alaska Native subsistence hunters and handicrafts and their collective relations with bears was in the heart of the compromise itself. Only a federally qualified subsistence user who intends to sell a brown bear claw handicraft must get the claws sealed. Other subsistence hunters and handicrafters, in those few pockets of territory where they're not already required to hunt under state regulations, need not do so. Rather than just ensuring the value of the state-sponsored trophy trade or disregarding the value of subsistence labor, this qualification intrudes into the dynamics of subsistence itself to rigorously enforce a distinction between those who sell and those who do not sell, those whose parts may be sold and those whose parts may not be sold, those who enjoy the protection of the federal subsistence management regime, and those who must conform to the law of the market. In making its distinction based on a decision to sell by an individual owner, not of the handicraft, but for the sake of sealing of the bear, the working group compromise actually represents an unequivocal victory of the state and the market over subsistence as a labor that is or would be characteristically opportunistic, collective, and above all, reciprocal. Going to the conclusion. The value of brown bear claws, like the value of anything, is ultimately indeterminate. It is indeterminate in the broad sense in which any given value can be understood as the subjective effect of individual desire. And it is indeterminate in the seemingly narrow or economic sense in which the objectivity of value depends on the value of labor power. As Marx argues and Spivak highlights, this uniquely self-valorizing value is determined by the value of the means of subsistence, which is itself determined partly by the value of labor power consumed in producing those same means. This potentially endless loop is closed off by the idea of an ultimate biological or natural limit to the reproduction of labor power. Here, beyond the pale of value as such, a host of unvalued or devalued activities convert the means of subsistence into subsistence itself in a way that by being deemed merely biological, merely animal, sometimes feminine, sometimes savage, allows the fiction of self-valorizing value to be maintained. For if their contribution to value could be fully recognized, the difference between the possible and the necessary, the unpaid labor upon which capitalism depends, would drain away. Brown bear claws embody this threat in at least 2 ways. And while I've told a story here of how this threat was contained, I'd like in conclusion to gesture towards a language and practice that might rather allow us to embrace its menace. Alaska Native subsistence, thanks largely to its practitioners' tenacious commitment to making sure that it is done and understood as something that exceeds both economic necessity and traditional constraints, holds the key. As a result of this labor, which includes the everyday practices of subsistence, hunting, fishing, handicrafting, and especially sharing, as well as advocacy through the RACs and other Alaska Native political organizations, what is called subsistence in Alaska is, first of all, not subsistence in the sense of something that could ever be reduced to a stable minimum against which any value-producing activity could be claimed as something extra. It is, on the contrary, a crucial way in which the form of social wealth produced in and through Alaska Native control of their lands and waters is both realized and renewed. In Southeast Alaska, brown bear claws signify this wealth both when they are woven into regalia for ceremonial display by the land's traditional owners and when they are traded for cash, the prices that, regardless of the buyer's intent, reflect the rarity of a form of wealth rooted in care and abundance. In this way, they threaten capitalist value by introducing a different scheme of wealth and power into circulation. But the reactionary effort to contain this threat also reveals the extent to which the regularity of value itself is constitutively exposed to the concept of subsistence and to the way that the limit function of this concept is perforated in practice anytime something in excess of necessity is produced and consumed outside the circuit of capital. Brown bear claws exemplify this danger too, since their superlative value is there for the taking as soon as a bear is killed, regardless of whether the killing was necessary, legitimate, or accidental. The market practically demands, so goes the story, that the self-maximizing individual, whose imaginary existence upholds the market's rationale, takes the claws and leaves the bear, so that any other outcome can only be achieved by extra economic coercion, the law, which the sportsman's code tries to domesticate as ethics, and the territorial sovereignty of the authorizing state, which relies on the sport hunt to surreptitiously cultivate the bears as its own natural stock, rather than as willful creatures with their own incentives for participation in the games people play. In this apparatus of capture, it is as much of a problem for the state and its sport hunters that subsistence hunters do not, in fact, kill bears for their claws, as it is that they might do so. Either way, the market is exposed as a force inadequate to sustaining the requirements of capitalist accumulation, thus foregrounding its persistent dependence on effectively, if not openly, colonial dynamics of dispossession. The limit function of subsistence is meant to control the market, but because it does not, or rather because subsistence, at least in Alaska, is determined by a set of practices that are not themselves determined by the market, subsistence must be controlled. This is why, in what amounted to almost 3 years of discussion concerning brown bear claw handicrafts between subsistence practitioners as represented through the RACs on the one hand, and federal and state authorities on the other, the demonstrable lack of a conservation concern kept reappearing as a problem that had to be overcome for the new regulation to pass. The high value of brown bear claws on the market was supposed to be a problem for the bears themselves, but it wasn't. Value was introduced as a way to argue that the additional restrictions would support, not stymie, quote unquote, legitimate bear claw handicraft sales to get around this absence of a biological rationale for them. This reveals value to be the subject of the law itself. If value does not determine the way rural Alaskan residents relate to the brown bears that surround them, then it also does not determine the value of their labor, which therefore returns to them as wealth. Clearly, this is a problem for a mode of production that depends entirely on the capture of surplus value. In this light, it is no surprise that the most powerful institutions of the leading capitalist country of the last century would be sure to enforce the boundaries necessary to sustain that form of society. It is far more surprising that, at least for a time and in part, the federal subsistence management regime provided a structure through which the determination of value and labor could be contested by a group of people whose abiding claim to the land remains a challenge to the legitimacy of those very institutions than it is that the Federal Subsistence Board ultimately accepted the working group compromise. It is nevertheless worth noting, even if it's not surprising, because the structure of the compromise, if not the political wrangling that led up to it, highlights what I believe are some serious problems with contemporary efforts to cope with the overwhelming sense of ecological crisis by reopening the question of the relationship between value and nature to critical discussion. As I reviewed briefly above, this discussion often hinges on whether the labor theory of value offers an accurate diagnosis of capitalism's tendency towards ecological destruction, or whether it betrays Marx's unreconstructed humanist bias, necessitating a correction, if not a total rejection of Marxism for the sake of the biosphere. A key issue in this discussion concerns the status of alternative valuations that might, unlike capitalism or its more orthodox alternatives, be capable of giving nature its due. Indigenous societies across the North, where enduring subsistence practices stand in stark contrast to early indications of the dramatic consequences being brought about by anthropogenic climate change, are frequently offered as examples of the promise of such alternative valuations. Although there is good reason to be inspired by the persistence of indigenous subsistence practices in Alaska and elsewhere, if critics writing far from the immediate site of such production are to support and defend them from the real threats they face, from the poisoning of waterways to the removal of crucial social services, or as in the present example, the imposition of burdensome regulations, then it is hard to imagine a more strangulating frame than the opposition of nature and value to do it. This is because the difference that matters to the good relations among humans and brown bears of Southeast Alaska depends on access to the market. It depends on both the wealth of the land and the fungibility of cash. And it depends on both of these, not just as a timeless characteristic of subsistence in itself, but as a specific politics conceived in an extraordinary history of resistance to colonial incursion. When human beings defend non-human nature from capitalism, and this is true regardless of whether they are wildlife managers defending brown bears from the market, or eco-critical scholars defending wallabies from the labor theory of value, they deny the material salience of these politics, which are a politics of transformation and opening, rather than of an isolated, vulnerable, quote unquote, alternative. It is far better to track the exclusions and limitations of value than it is to rhetorically assimilate vast indigenous civilizations and the non-humans are a part of them to the doomed humanist wasteland of nature. But it would be better still to follow the lead of Alaskan subsistence hunters, handicrafters, and advocates who have long been able to participate in capitalist value production without being ruled by it. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you so much for that talk. There's so many amazing thoughts that were elaborated or even just like quickly telegraphed that could just open up to so much more. I think that's the 2MO is alert to what are kind of unique ways. And I love even the the sense of humor that's in your talk about defending the wallabies from the labor theory of value. So all those in favor of that, join up now. So we will have some time now for questions to the speaker, and you can submit them in the Q&A box. So it's the button at the bottom of your screen. Please remember to keep your questions brief, and I'll do my best to get through as many of the questions as we can, but I can't guarantee that I will get to all of them. But I think I'll start it off, Danielle. I've got a whole bunch of questions, so we'll see where I get interrupted. But one of the things I like about the general kind of like epistemological disposition that you bring forth in the work is to kind of point out and struggle with the inadequacy of terms and concepts. And I find it really striking because so many of them just kind of readily accept them or maybe even don't. I was going to use the word interrogate them, but I'm actually myself trying to avoid valorizing terms like interrogate to as naturalizing and even celebrating a violent relationship to knowledge production, but to explore these terms. So maybe you could just kind of stand back a little bit from the talk itself, and if you could, I'm just going to throw out 4 of the terms that you raise that you kind of point to their inadequacy. And I think throughout the talk, you kind of alluded to this in various ways, but maybe you could pick two or 3 of them maybe to just talk about. But so the 4 that I'm going to throw out there are nature, subsistence, labor, and exploitation. And I would just be really curious for your just kind of quick riff on how might we tend to use these in inadequate ways? Like what might we tend to assume with them? And what are some of the places that you're interested in poking at? Where do you see something more to those or different about those than might be commonly kind of expected? So I just throw that over to you for the first one.
That's a very kind question, and especially given I get the choice of words,
Right.
I'm more vulnerable with respect to some of them than others. And I think, like nature is the no pun intended low-hanging fruit in this one. The sort of the critique of the concept of nature is pretty well established. I'm not making it up at all. I do think there's a thing where because of the current emergency, it's sort of come back. Like, I think we've forgotten some of the lessons of the problem of the idea. And there's reasons for that, but there's a sort of here because of, maybe people don't say nature, maybe they do, maybe they say ecology, but it's like, here are these imperatives we have to follow, nothing else matters. And I think there's problems with that, I guess, and I try to describe in the paper, because it misses the ways that, there's still something we're talking about there, but
yeah,
this is a chance to work with the people and beings who are doing the best for our common world, I guess. So that's easy. Subsistence is much more difficult has been a sort of lifelong problem, because I guess I have always thought it was interesting and worth pursuing that what I'm describing in this paper is called subsistence, even though everyone in Alaska says it shouldn't be, because they all know that subsistence means this thing it means in political economy, which is this limit that, sort of, they reject the economic, well, not complete. That's part of what, so to me, the sort of main, even though I've gone through the bear claw example, I guess, and there's reasons to do that, but the purpose of this paper, if it ever succeeds in becoming a great paper, is basically to justify why I think it's worth still using the word. And that's why it's worth the sort of difficult detour to Spivak's work, because the whole idea of deconstruct is like, you use the word, but you know it's not quite right.
Yeah.
And that word in particular is like not quite right for political economy in a way that speaks to the way it's not quite right for Alaskan Natives. So this is my like, subsistence is a useful word, or not useful,
Well,
yeah, what you should say. Other words we can't say. Productive word, generative, interesting word.
one thing just on that,
Yeah.
that just to kind of engage with this a little bit, like, and I wrote a short piece on subsistence and about how I like just kind of curious if it in part was a kind of European colonial fantasy of a way of life that actually never existed. But then that from that fantasy from back in Adam Smith's day, or others are talking about their idea of what was happening in America,
Right.
back to Europe, if then that becomes kind of reinstituted and then formulated in laws. So I mean, you're talking about something with such a powerful legal status and political status. So it's, I'm just curious then though, like how do folks in Alaska kind of push back on it? Or I mean, you gave some hints to that.
You're right to point out like so many things. Just that's sort of like a detail that's not in this paper that now I'm glad you referenced your thing that I need to situate in here, because even like so many pieces of political economy, even the concept is derived already from this misrecognition of what was going on here. So it's like the entanglement is sort of endless.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a super good point. But I think your question was how people push. I mean, people say, I mean, now, like lately, people are talking much more about food sovereignty instead of subsistence. Which, you know, there you can sort of see how that's a more powerful claim. And that was not, you know, that wouldn't have been politically possible when the subsistence law was crafted. So there's some ways that subsistence reflected the sort of limitations of the politics of the moment and was the best people could do. And now, not just because sort of people are more galvanized to fight, and that's one reason, but also, you know, this moment I'm describing, this like historical moment that I'm describing in this paper, it did really happen. And I don't think Alaska Native people think the federal subsistence law is as good as it used to be, or as like is not working. I mean, the principles are still good, but it is sort of continuously failed to do the things that it originally seemed to be doing, like in the early years. And so that was to engage with this, and this is something I guess I should, subsistence was worth it. The word subsistence was worth it to use in order to engage with this law that was promising. Interesting, yeah. But now that it's not, there's sort of no less reason to use it. To hold on to it, yeah. So it opened up things too that like in the, you know, a lot of Canada and a lot of the lower 8 don't really exist, I mean, which makes Alaska so fascinating in so many ways on that way. But yeah, it's interesting to think about like as it's like usefulness in a certain historical moment that may move on. Yeah, great. Here's I got a few questions coming in that I just wanted to get to. And Hilda Fernandez says, thanks for the rich talk. Could you please summarize your argument on the perspective of the value of nature? Thanks. So yeah, I mean, you kind of got to it at so many different levels in the talk. And if you could, kind of like put it together into a bow as much as you could. Or, yeah, if I could do that, I would have successfully included a lot more papers. But so let me see if I can. It's a good question, and this is being recorded, so maybe I can save it. That's right. If I make it, and if I fail, well, I was already failing. So I basically, I think so. I think that it is true, as Marx says, that there is no value in nature. But I think that is true because nature is the name for what does not have value. Wow. Not because that is sort of, that is the structure of the value term itself requires this whole realm that is not valued. And by naming that nature, you hide all these things that are not valued. And where I think Spivak is helpful, and other Marxist feminists, post-colonial critics and indigenous critics have pointed this out, is that under that, what is hidden there in nature is, well, reproduction, is these social relationships, are all these things that are quite laborious, that get cut out and called nature. So that's my argument. So it's like, yes, it is. It's not that everything that is, it is not that. So yeah, that's in a nutshell the argument, that nature covers the necessary sort of negation of value to make the capitalist value form function. And again, I appreciate Spivak for showing that functioning is like always contingent. We do all these things to try to sort of say it's this or it's that, and here's how it works, and but it's not, it's like never actually doing this perfectly. And then we are, in our efforts to interpret it, we are basically implicated in this, like sort of making it seem to work. And I do think it's important to affirm that nature doesn't have value, because otherwise we sort of give it value basically for capitalism and continue to participate in the hiding of the things that the term covers. So then,
well,
that's my argument in a nutshell.
That poses a big problem to all those people working out to exactly pinpoint the value of ecological services.
Yes, for sure. Yes, and then they've been well critical. But yes, that's one of the, like, we already know that's problematic, because that is obviously sort of. But it would be an interesting sort of line of research if you could say, okay, what, when we're giving these things value, if they do have value within the context of the labor theory value, which I think is correct, you can, I mean, and this is where Karen and I's work comes in, I guess, you say whose labor is being neglected. Like, you can always find someone who should be being paid for that who's not.
Right.
And then it's really a sort of, that whole thing is a sort of scheme of wealth transfer from these property owners who cultivate, ecosystem services, while not acknowledging the things that people who are sort of living in those areas do to make sure that they're available for others to use.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. This one, here's another one from Rosemary Collard.
Hi, Rosemary.
Thanks for such a thoughtful talk and analysis. I appreciate how you theoretically and empirically build up your insightful point about colonial schemes being at the very heart of the story.
About what schemes?
Colonial schemes.
Okay, great. Thanks. That's right. At the very end.
Yeah. And it makes me wonder, what is the role of science or scientific knowledge in the story, and maybe in value production itself, at least in this context? That's great.
That's also an excellent question. And if there's like science is in here, so it's almost another whole story, but I feel like you could write the same paper substituting science for the market here, where it's like, where there's this sort of overdrawn opposition between scientific and non-scientific knowledge, or scientific and indigenous knowledge, that is like, that speaks partly to some, that like wants to talk about a difference that's really there, but in overdrawing the contrast sort of prevents it, like, rather than honoring indigenous knowledge, it closes off the it prevents indigenous people from having access to the power of scientific knowledge. So in this particular story, the issue is the scientific fact. So science should be on our side, I guess. Like, there is no problem with brown bears biologic, like the sort of what natural science knows. The evidence that natural science was able to present in the story is that there's no problem here. Like, we don't need this, like, bears are fine.
In terms of their population, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But but the state calls its regime scientific management, which people know, which means basically this sort of like calculated maximum sustained yield principle, which subsistence gets in the way of, sort of regardless of the health of the population, because subsistence harvested bears don't maximize value in the scheme. And so that's science and another. So there's sort of two, as maybe always the case, sort of different uses of science. But when you think of science as like I think the colonialism is that part of the colonial dynamic with respect to this contrast is why it was possible to ignore the fact that there was no scientific evidence in support of this regulation, because it was able to be seen as a like sort of traditional practices versus scientific knowledge still, even though that wasn't really the case. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's good and interesting, and it's makes me also wonder sometimes when it's like the use of the term scientific management, how it's definitely claiming a space of being apolitical as yeah, it's not us that's determining it, it's just the numbers of what, but not really discussed in terms of how, like, what are the numbers being collected or for what age.
And this is I know I should let the next question, but this is something I think Rosemary might be more interested in. What's actually really, maybe you know this anyway, but part of the problem is that bears are really hard to manage. Like, they are not easily known to science, whether it's bad science or good science. And so part of the sort of stress, there is a sort of real need the state feels to make sure that hunting happens in accordance with the things that do sort of appear on their grid of like, we are confident in this form of calculation, so our science holds. But if you start like messing with that and introducing all these like uncertainties and subsistence among them, then their grid falls apart pretty quickly, because bears are unpredictable, impossible to count, and they sort of do their own. They cause their own problems for the production of value out of their bodies.
Yeah,
it could be another whole paper.
Well, that's actually a perfect segue in for your next question. And
okay.
Just one kind of thought on just the bears before I get to the question. I think it's really interesting thinking like in very specific ways about the organisms that we're trying to understand and get to know, and just like how, like with Carinate bears work, like with the salmon, I remember pointing out the way that like population studies of dead beings, like of those that are captured in the net and killed and tallied.
Yeah.
Whereas the kinds of ways of like understanding the lives of bears are not through like always through their death, in the way that it may be for certain kinds of salmon, but also death becomes this kind of final.
It is sort of, yeah.
So here we go. This is from Nicholas Scott, and he says, can you please elaborate a little on the agency and volition of bears themselves and their labors in shaping or resisting the intriguing regulations and market-driven activities you discussed in your amazing talk? You bears require a kind of sovereignty to help challenge capitalism. Thanks.
Yeah. So there's a whole other paper you could write about what the bears are doing here. And because I felt it was urgent to work out the stuff about subsistence and respond to these debates in a certain way, they sort of fall away, but I feel a bit bad about it. So two things, but they don't like completely. So one of the things that I believe, I guess, and that is that this case, the Southeast Alaskan case, I think provides evidence of, is that there are like the agency of bears is not independent of the agency of people who live there, not because they're like constituted by that in some like, not because they don't have their own agency, but because brown bears throughout the world are always in relation to the people that have been the human beings that have inhabited this landscape with them throughout time. You don't like, and especially coastal brown bears, which are different from grizzlies, partly for that reason. Like they're not solitary in the same way that grizzlies are known to be, and they because they concentrate on the coasts and consume salmon in vast quantities, much like the people, they are like, I do not want to use the word adapted, but they are accustomed to sort of doing what they do for themselves alongside people. And that's only possible also because the people are doing that. So when I talk about the labor of subsistence here, that, sometimes is like opportunistically hunting a bear, but is also living off a landscape that involves sort of avoiding bears half the time. That's another big part of the story. So bears are part of and any, not just an Alaska Native person, anyone living in Southeast Alaska or coastal Alaska would say that, very few of the things that people that are valued, the sort of bounty of the landscape depends on bears in large respects. So they are an important part of the subsistence economy as actors, not just as food.
Right. Not just as like a resource to be killed, to be exploited, to have the fur or the claws, but like an everyday, like a neighbor that one has to engage with at the stream bank or at the berry patch or everywhere else.
So to me, like, if you think of reproduction, I guess is even more like the sort of reproduction of the mixed cash subsistence economy of Southeast Alaska is achieved by the labor in the sense of both bears and people to sort of maintain the sort of the ecosystem at the level of abundance necessary to sustain both groups. And they have worked together over centuries to make that the case. And that's why it's important to fight for and defend subsistence ways of life, because that's the key. Like, if you care about bears, those ways of being are okay with bears.
Have worked out for centuries.
Really, and like, frankly, the sport hunt is also successful in the sense that in the way it works to maximize, like, the sport hunt isn't causing a problem with the bear population either. Depending on what you mean by a problem. Because there are people who say it is causing a problem because there may be too many bears in like certain places, as in the sort of like, but not a problem of over. So the bears themselves have everything to do with the entire system, which wouldn't sort of be working if it weren't for them. And then in their elusiveness, they are also part of the sort of, to go back to Rosemary's, the kind of retreat of science into this market calculation, which works because you can't really sort of you can't really control bears, just like you can't really control subsistence. So the sort of effort of management retreats to trying to control, to try to close off the things they can control and rely on the market to do it for you, because to actually sort of the state would not be capable of actually taking care of the bears.
I like how you
hopefully that answers enough.
The way beyond. I mean, I love the idea of kind of injecting more history into natural history, or just even think about those, like the specific historic relations at the salmon patches at these main places of both dense populations of humans and bears that may have shaped the bears, like biology. We often assume to be separate from human presence. But that's really interesting. Just curious too, like why you shied away from the word adapted to. I'm just curious what.
Because that seems like adaptation, bad word.
Why?
Because that suggests an automatic response to sort of external force, as opposed to a willful shaping of circumstances for purposes.
That's really interesting. It's like a way to talk about non-humans changing, but without like kind of stripped of agency, maybe in a way, or something.
Yeah, they're
like
just
that.
they're adapting to circumstances.
Yeah. And I've been curious about, like, is there a sense of like obvious predictability loaded into the term that then seems to take away any chance for incredible choice of the different species.
It's induced change instead of made change, or like
great. One just last question for you to just elaborate on a little bit. Like you, in the middle of the talk, you said this was a kind of way of thinking of this as a struggle, as a kind of shorthand over meeting, and you were then kind of implicating your own work in your previous work in that. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to kind of elaborate on what that framing was, and then what you're kind of more interested in. Like, I'm curious, like there's one thing that you said later that I really liked, was something about like gave me something new to notice here. Like maybe it's like in relationship to what one already expected, what one already anticipated, or like a way of framing between the two sides or whatever have you. But I'm just kind of curious if you could explain a little bit about what that meant to you, like what you did and why you no longer want to do that.
Well, frankly, I mean, I don't think I was doing what the ecosystem services guys were doing, but I thought I could, like, there's a version of this paper where I'm like, the conclusion is this is what the value of a bear claw is. Mm-hmm. I need to find it. And if I find it and can describe it, then I don't know what I've accomplished, some sort of demonstration of theoretical chops or something, and like, or what is, what are these different types of value, trophy values, all these values that are nameable, and then seeing, and competing. So it's like, and I think there were plenty of places in this, and even the abstract, which I sort of, you could see that anyway, there's language in the paper still about like competing regimes of value, or there's this value and that value, and they're in competition, and you sort of want the good one to win out, or the other one, whether it's the value of nature or subsist, like whatever, you come up with the right name for it and understand how it works and how they play out in circulation and how they're produced, or whatever. But I think there's a lot of subtlety, and it's not just Spivak's point, the point of the complicity between economic values defined by Marx and like the strict definition of value and any other ones, like you're like that come back to sort of the stuff, come back to where you're like, in Spivak's writing, it's like where you're situated as a scholar talking about it, like as though it does. I guess it's what I think she means by textuality, which I'm not totally sure I understand, but like, here I am talking about this stuff and you're listening, like, because it wouldn't be happening if there was an economic value under there. And so there's this like, and that gives you a certain responsibility to any kind of speech, even if I wasn't talking about value, it would be relevant. Or I think her claim is that you should always be talking about value because that's the only thing you're talking about anyway. And so, but so to me, instead of, and all this, like, it really, what feels like, I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, like wasted effort to try to define what this thing was and determine it, when it was so much more liberating, frankly, to be like, oh, all these places you can't determine it, or because that's how it works.
Right.
Like, that's wonderful. Like, this doesn't work. Here's another example, and I can just, now I can sort of go through and find all these not workings. And see the stress that, like, with respect to the, like, these, scientists or these managers are doing to try to make these schemes work when they don't.
That's
and that's like super hopeful, I think, in some ways, if we can appreciate that instead of thinking it's a problem and not contribute to capitalism effectively by trying to define these things.
Right. That's so interesting. Totally different, like way of it's way more than, I was going to say a pivot, but it's way more than a pivot. It's a
it's like
a different way through.
It's like I don't know what you call it.
Yeah. Okay.
And I don't know if I really have, it's sort of a method that's challenging. I don't know if I actually have the skill to do it, but it seems like a good idea. It was helped me get to this point with you guys. So
yeah,
appreciate the chance.
You are doing it, I think. So, and we've gone a little bit over our time already so quickly. So I just want to thank you so much for that fantastic talk. Thanks to everyone for being here on what is here on the West Coast, the afternoon. And just a reminder that it's recorded. And so it will be available on our departmental website in the coming weeks. And we will send an email to you when it is up there. Please take care, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Michael and Dasa and Jan, and thanks everyone for listening. I really appreciated the chance to talk to you today.
All right. Take care, everybody.